And last time we were talking about the idea of ESP summation at the trigger zone. We emphasized the idea that on the input region of a neuron there may be several thousand or at least a few hundred of these individual synaptic sites. And the individual synaptic sites that we talked about last time were the ones that used an excitatory neurotransmitter, most likely glutamate in the central nervous system. That the effect of the glutamate was to bind to a ligand-gated ionotropic channel, and the binding of the glutamate to that ligand-gated ionotropic receptor, at least, was then to swing open the channel, allowing sodium to come in. Because sodium was depolarizing, this was said to be an excitatory response, an excitatory postsynaptic potential. And the excitatory postsynaptic potential, then, each EPSP generated at each synaptic site was fairly small, no more than a millivolt at most. And where we closed was the idea that although we needed to add together many of these EPSPs at the trigger zone, that it would likely take the input of a few hundred or at least tens of these individual excitatory synapses to generate enough depolarization to bring the trigger zone to threshold. Where we left off was the idea of changes, or at least the resistance of the membrane in the input region. So we talked about the idea of the membrane resistance as either being high or low. A high membrane resistance was like a good garden hose, where not much of the water leaked out of the garden hose, and here not much of the potassium leaks out of the membrane. That's a high resistance. But we also could then put many of these leak channels in that membrane. So now this membrane would have lots of sites where the potassium could leak out. So that's a leaky membrane. It would have a low resistance. And so we'll talk about this. And we'll talk about the effects of the membrane resistance on the amplitude or voltage of the potential when it reaches the trigger zone. In other words, if we have a tight membrane with few leak channels, the voltage generated at the synaptic site will more or less be faithfully delivered to the trigger zone. If we have a membrane that's leaky, in other words, it has lots and lots of potassium leak channels, then this potential will be small when it reaches the trigger zone, and that's going to be determined by this value R sub L. We'll emphasize the idea here that the voltage change across the membrane is equal to the resistance of the membrane times the current. Current is just a measurement of the number of ions that flow. The more ions that flow, the bigger the current. The fewer ions that flow, the smaller the current. But we're going to see that, for our purposes at least, for a given synapse, we have a finite number of receptors. If a finite number of receptors bind a finite number of neurotransmitter molecules, then you'll get a finite number of those channels opening to give a finite or pretty much fixed number of ions flowing. So this number, for our purposes, isn't going to change for much for each of those synapses. So then we can think about the voltage shift across the membrane being dependent largely on the membrane resistance, and we'll talk about the membrane resistance being high in tight membranes or low in leaky membranes. This discussion will be entirely predicated on the idea of simply having potassium leak channels. But biology doesn't work very much that way. Biology works through the addition of a new set of ion channels. And we're going to talk now about the role of inhibition in the input region. And what we're going to see is one of the major roles of inhibition in the input region is to affect R sub M. But to see how that happens, we have to walk our way through inhibitory synaptic transmission. We have to talk about the ideas of inhibitory neurotransmitters being mostly GABA, gamma-aminobutyric acid, and another amino acid called glycine. But regardless of which of these neurotransmitters we use, the outcome is the same, and that is these neurotransmitters will bind to a ligand-gated ionotropic channel receptor. In other words, there will be GABA receptors, alternatively, there will be glycine receptors. The binding of GABA to a GABA receptor or glycine to a glycine receptor leads to the opening of a channel, just as we saw before. But where we begin to see a difference here is that the type of channel that opens is different. Where for the EPSP, these were all dependent upon cation channels. They were dependent upon the influx of sodium. But here, these neurotransmitters of GABA and glycine are going to bind to a receptor and open a channel that now is permeable to chloride. So now we have a new ion moving across the membrane. But the story is the same. Remember that the membrane potential seeks the equilibrium potential for the ion whose permeability is dominant. And so if we open up a whole bunch of chloride channels, that's going to increase the membrane permeability to chloride. That's going to drive the equilibrium potential, it's going to drive the membrane potential toward the equilibrium potential for chloride. And we'll see initially, at least in our first pass through this, that equilibrium potential for chloride will be set at a point more negative than the resting membrane potential. It will be an inhibitory postsynaptic potential, which will be hyperpolarizing. It's easiest to recognize what's happening here if we think about the change in voltage, if we think about the idea that opening chloride channels makes the inside of the membrane more negative. But recognize that it's not so much the change in voltage that's important as the change in permeability. What we're going to do is we're going to drive the membrane potential toward the equilibrium potential for a new ion. We're going to drive the membrane potential now toward the equilibrium potential for chloride. In our initial run-through, we're going to say the equilibrium potential for chloride is more negative than the resting membrane potential. So it'll be hyperpolarization. But we can equally set the equilibrium potential, and different cells will set their equilibrium potentials at different points. We can set the equilibrium potential exactly to the resting membrane potential. And that means that when you open the chloride channels, the membrane potential doesn't change because the equilibrium potential for chloride is the same as the resting membrane potential. But it's still inhibitory because if now on top of that you try to add some depolarization, you fix the membrane potential toward or near the equilibrium potential for chloride, which is right at the resting membrane potential. It's fixed at that point. In some cases, in fact, you can set the equilibrium potential for chloride more positive than the resting membrane potential. And in this case, you'll bind the inhibitory neurotransmitter, either GABA or glycine. You'll open the channel, and chloride will flow out. It will flow out, making the membrane more positive. But as long as the equilibrium potential for chloride is below threshold, you're going to fix the membrane potential at that point, because no matter what you try to do, the membrane potential seeks the equilibrium potential for the ion whose permeability is dominant. If the dominant permeability is to chloride, you're fixed at that point. So this is a more sophisticated way of thinking about inhibition. It's more sophisticated in that it's not dependent simply on hyperpolarizing the membrane. What's more is when we open these chloride channels, as far as the cell is concerned, it doesn't matter whether it has open potassium leak channels or whether it has open chloride channels. To the cell, it's the same thing. That's largely because what it's going to do is it's going to change the membrane resistance. So we know that we can change the membrane resistance by adding more or fewer potassium channels, but it's also true here that we can change the membrane resistance by adding more or fewer chloride channels. But the beauty of this system is we now have a means, through the use of inhibitory neurotransmitters and inhibitory neurons, we can regulate the number of chloride channels that are open and thereby regulate the membrane resistance. So now if we make the membrane leakier, and so that means this number becomes smaller, so we can say here that an increase in leakiness reduces R sub m. A reduction in leakiness increases R sub m. So hold on to those ideas, because now if we make the membrane more permeable to chloride, we're now going to reduce the membrane resistance. We'll now reduce the amplitude of excitatory postsynaptic potentials. In addition, we'll also change the time course of those potentials, because R sub m affects the tau, the time constant of the potential. And when R sub m goes down, tau gets shorter, the potential gets shorter. We're mostly going to emphasize the effect on voltage. But let's start here with where we had it last time. So this is one of our canonical pineapple neurons. And all over the input region, all over that input region as we had last time, on the cell body as well as on the dendrites, we have hundreds, perhaps even thousands, of these output regions of excitatory neurons. These excitatory neurons in the central nervous system, for the most part, release glutamate. And we said last time that the release of the glutamate opened the operated channels. And that the glutamate operated channels now increased the membrane permeability to sodium. In other words, they opened a cation channel. And we said that if we would take a recording at this point, that we would see the membrane potential go from about minus 70 millivolts, and when we would open the ligand-gated channels at that site, the opening of the ligand-gated channels would generate a depolarization of the membrane that went from, minus 70 millivolts to at most minus 69 millivolts. So we then described what was happening at each of these individual sites. We described the change in the membrane potential generated from opening the ligand-gated channels just in the immediate neighborhood. And then we asked the question, what happens to the amplitude of that potential as it propagates along this membrane? Because remember, the other characteristics of the input region is not only is it enriched it's enriched for ligand-gated channels, it largely lacks voltage-gated channels. We said that that was in contrast to this region of the neuron we call the conductal region. And that the conductal region had, particularly right at this interface between the axon and the cell body, right at the interface between the input region and the conductal region, we saw that there was a clustering of voltage-gated sodium channels at the trigger zone. And then, of course, that those voltage-gated sodium channels were accompanied by their counterparts, the voltage-gated potassium channels. And those were the channels that were responsible for generating and propagating the action potential. But now what we want to think about is how do we manage to initially open these channels? How do we use these ligand-gated channels, which are allowing sodium to come in through those ionotropic channels? How do we use these guys to affect these guys? The answer to that is that if we get a depolarization here that's about 1 millivolt, and then we would take measurements at points along the membrane here, we would see that this membrane potential, if it were a millivolt here, by the time it reaches this site, may be down to 0.5. By the time it reaches the trigger zone, the membrane potential may go from minus 70 millivolts to minus 69.9 millivolts. So the problem here is that the leak channels are siphoning off positive charge. And because they're siphoning off positive charge, the amplitude of these EPSPs, the EPSP amplitude, becomes smaller. With distance. This is just the story we told early on when we had the thought experiment where we put the voltage-gated channels at one end of an axon and only had leak channels along the rest. And we emphasized the idea that that charge, that potential, would leak out across the membrane. The same thing is happening here. But now we have much tinier potentials. That means by the time the potential reaches the trigger zone, the potential that was generated by an individual synaptic site here, this depolarization may be 1/10 of a millivolt. But remember what we're trying to do, though. The function of this whole system is to provide adequate charge at the trigger zone to move those S4 regions and fire an action potential. But threshold, typically at this point, requires we drive the membrane potential from minus 70 millivolts to about minus 55 millivolts before we reach that magic point where sodium efflux exceeds potassium. Sodium influx exceeds potassium efflux, and we fire an action potential. That's the function we're trying to do here. The point I'm trying to make is that even this 1 millivolt depolarization, if all of this charge were to arrive at the trigger zone, it's inadequate to generate the opening of a sufficient number of these voltage-gated channels to produce an action potential. It means that we need many, many of these synaptic sites working in concert to bring this membrane to threshold. So we must have the EPSPs from individual synapses must add together. The official term for this is summate. At the trigger zone. The way I normally show this, the way we normally think about this, is to start out at minus 70 millivolts. And then imagine at this point we begin to see the arrival of the EPSPs. But each of these EPSPs produces a very small depolarization. So now we have to have multiple of these synaptic sites, each one of these synaptic sites contributing a very small amount of depolarization, each one producing a small depolarization, but taking together, working in concert, they can drive the membrane potential to threshold, which is normally in the neighborhood of minus 55 millivolts. So two things to concentrate on here. First is that it takes many, many synaptic inputs, many, many EPSPs to provide sufficient positive charge to bring the membrane to threshold to fire an action potential. It takes a lot of them. The second idea to think about is the role of these leak channels. If we have lots and lots of leak channels, what's going to happen to the amplitude of each of these EPSPs as they move across this leaky membrane? What's going to happen to the positive charge? It's going to go out. So what's that going to do to the amplitude? It's going to get smaller. So that means for a leaky membrane, much of the positive charge of an EPSP leaks out of the membrane. before arriving at the trigger zone. But we can turn that argument on its head if you'd like. I mean, we can talk about a tight membrane. We can think about a membrane which has few leak channels. And if there are not many avenues through which the positive charge can leave the cell, then if the membrane is tight, the potential arriving at the trigger zone will be fairly faithful and will take fewer of these synaptic sites to become active to generate enough positive charge to reach threshold. That's a fancy way of saying that the membrane resistance, R sub m, that is either leaky or non-leaky, determines EPS amplitude arriving at the trigger zone. If you take another course in electrophysiology, you'll see I'm skating over a lot of stuff. I'm emphasizing the membrane resistance, but remember that this current is also moving through the cytoplasm, and so there will be an axial resistance as well. I just want to think about the membrane resistance. So we're going to take two cells that are exactly the same so that their axial resistance, cytoplasmic resistance is the same, but now we can vary the membrane resistance. So let's just think about what's going on with the membrane. We can now invoke something called Ohm's law. And Ohm's law says that the change in voltage, delta V, is equal to the membrane resistance, in our simplified view, times the current, I. Current, this is current, and it's simply describing the number of ions moving across the membrane. Now, the number of ions that are moving across the membrane at one of these synaptic sites is pretty much always the same. You'll release maybe 5,000 molecules of neurotransmitter at one of these sites, but you may only have a few hundred receptors for those neurotransmitters. So you're now going to open a finite number of channels that will produce pretty much a fixed number of ions moving. So we can say for our thought experiment here is this doesn't change. That's fixed. So the delta V now is equal to the membrane resistance, R sub m, times this fixed number for current. So for an EPSP, this isn't going to change. But now we can imagine either a high R sub m or a low R sub m. If R sub m is high, that's a tight membrane. So high R sub m is few leak channels. If R sub m is big, and this number is fixed, what does that say about delta V? It's big. If now we say R sub m, this is really, really leaky membrane, so a leaky membrane has a low R sub m. So if this number is now small, then if this number is small and this number is fixed, what's it say about our delta V? Small. So what we're saying here is that the amplitude of the EPSP arriving at the trigger zone, the amplitude of the EPSP arriving at the trigger zone is largely dependent upon the membrane resistance. The higher the membrane resistance, the more faithful the amplitude of the potential recorded here that will be delivered to this site. The lower the membrane resistance, the more of that current laid on the membrane here at the synapse is going to leak out, so that means this potential will be smaller when it reaches here. So delta V, the amplitude of the potential arriving at the trigger zone, is proportional to the membrane resistance. the higher the membrane resistance, the bigger the delta V. The lower the membrane resistance, the smaller the delta V. If the delta V arriving here at the trigger zone is small for each one of these synapses, that simply tells you you're going to have many, many more active synapses to provide adequate charge. If each one of these synapses is delivering a reasonable amount of positive charge at the site, you simply need to have fewer synapses active to bring enough positive charge to bear on the voltage-gated channels to fire an action potential. So basically what all we're saying here is that there's a decision point here at the trigger zone. The decision point is whether or not you'll fire an action potential. That decision point is reached whether or not you reach threshold. Whether or not you reach threshold is dependent upon the number of these EPSPs summating or adding together at the trigger zone. But the number required to sum together to get to threshold is largely dependent upon the membrane resistance. The higher the membrane resistance, the larger the potential larger delta V generated for each one of them at this site, so the fewer synapses active you need to have. If, however, this is a leaky membrane, you're just going to have a whole bunch more synapses that need to be active to reach threshold. So any questions on that? Because we're going to use that idea. If you put your phone away, I'd appreciate it. Don't look too surprised. So what we want to do now is think about how we can change the membrane resistance. And by changing the membrane resistance, change the amplitude of the potentials arriving here. Yes?
I was a little thrown off because I thought that at the neurotransmitters, sodium was being brought into the cell, but I thought those were potassium leak channels. So unless I'm wrong somewhere, I'm not seeing the correlation between like the number of leak channels and the charge that arrives at the voltage-gated channel.
Okay, so here the confusion here I think arises, and it's a really common point of confusion. We're saying out here at the synaptic site we're opening channels to sodium, and sodium's coming in. The charge on sodium, however, is positive. Now, we're not going to change the sodium concentration here very much. All we're going to do is change the charge. So then, all along the membrane, the only charge carrier we have to have available to carry positive charge out is potassium. So again, this is just like the action potential. We depolarize using sodium, we repolarize using potassium, because that's the only charge carrier we have with an appropriate gradient to carry charge out. And so the same story is here. We're going to use the 110 millimolar potassium on the inside versus 4 on the outside. We're going to use that gradient to bring the potassium charge, the positive charge of potassium, out of the cell and repolarize the membrane. Now, for our purposes here, we're repolarizing the membrane only through the loss of positive charge, making this potential ever less positive as it propagates on the membrane. But the only ion you have to do that is potassium, because it's the only one that has the right gradient. And to get the potassium to move, you need a potassium channel. And in this particular case, we're using the passive leak channels of the potassium. Right. Yes?
Are there any neurons that don't have potassium leak channels?
There are no, so the question is, are there any neurons that don't have potassium leak channels? The answer is no. In order to generate a membrane potential, you have to have a potassium leak channel. And in fact, all cells have a membrane potential, and all cells have a small potassium leak. And all cells have way more potassium in the inside than the outside. Let me go behind you and then I'll...
So at the trigger zone, that's where we launch the action potential, or where the decision is made whether we should or not. And that's determined by the resting membrane.
So, okay.
Membrane resistance. And that's called, so like if it's a low membrane resistance, then it's leaky.
Yes.
Okay. Why would you want it to have a low membrane resistance?
So, okay. So the question here is one I want to approach here in a moment. So the point he's making is that you would think that you'd want to be as efficient as possible when delivering positive charge from all these excitatory synapses to generate sufficient positive charge to the site to bring it to threshold. So that every time you fired one out here, you get one to fire here. Why not make it as efficient as possible? The answer to that is that we really want to be able to regulate the probability of reaching threshold here. Now, we have done this simply in a fixed fashion here by putting in potassium leak channels. The next step, where we're headed next, is to talk about inhibition. And what inhibition is going to do is precisely what you suggest. It's going to change the membrane resistance here. By opening chloride channels, we can reduce the membrane resistance. By closing chloride channels, we can increase the membrane resistance. So we can now affect the membrane resistance in this input region and thereby determine and regulate the number of synaptic sites that need to be active to fire an action potential at this site. Now, part of this confusion results from the way we're forced to teach this. We teach it from the point of view of we have a depolarization, the depolarization adds together to here to fire an action potential, and so it's all about adding things together. That's true, except in biology, the default pathway is to have so much excitatory input that you fire action potentials all the time. And so what we need to do in biology is regulate these membrane resistances. And we regulate the membrane resistances in the input region largely through inhibition. And so by invoking inhibitory synapses now, we can regulate the membrane resistance and thereby regulate the amplitude of the potentials arriving at this site. The default pathway in most nervous systems is to have too much excitation. And if you remove inhibition, neurons fire out of control. Seizure disorders, for example, are thought to be, in many cases, not always, but in many cases, a lack of appropriate inhibition. And so if you block inhibition, the nervous system goes crazy. It just fires too many action potentials. And so the lack of inhibition is a lack of regulation of the membrane resistance. So in a dynamic system, we want to be able to regulate the membrane resistance. So if we make it higher, it's more efficient for delivering delivering EPSPs. If we make the membrane resistance lower, it's less efficient. So we can gradate that over a broad term, and that's the way we regulate whether or not neurons will fire. And without inhibition, our nervous systems are running amok. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay. And then you had a question too. Okay. Yes.
Okay, so I just want to make sure that I'm understanding what you're saying. So no matter if the resting membrane potential is high or low, EPSP has to reach threshold. So if it has a lower membrane resistance, it just has to work harder to reach threshold.
So let's review what it's going to take to bring the membrane potential to threshold at the trigger zone. This is simply providing sufficient positive charge that we get into the neighborhood of minus 55 millivolts. The way we supply enough positive charge at this site to depolarize the membrane potential to minus 55 millivolts is to have these excitatory potentials add together or summate at the trigger zone. And so in most cases, we'll need maybe 100 of these to summate at the trigger zone. So each, 100 individual synapses must become active more or less simultaneously to provide sufficient positive charge at the trigger zone to fire an action potential. And so you have to get these guys working in concert to provide the positive charge. But each synapse provides only maybe 1% of the charge needed at this site to get it to threshold.
So whether or not it's a leaky membrane or not doesn't change that.
Okay, so whether or not it's a leaky membrane, whether or not the leaky membrane determines the fidelity of the depolarization reaching this site. The tighter the membrane, the greater the fidelity of the depolarization, the amplitude of the depolarization reaching the site, because less of the amplitude has leaked out across the membrane. Okay? And the leakier the membrane, the less fidelity, and it is decayed more, so you get less positive charge. Yes?
Does having a higher or lower membrane potential vary on the stimulus that's being given?
So the question here is, what regulates the amplitude of the excitatory postsynaptic potential? At each of these individual sites, it's only dependent upon the release of 1 or 2 vesicles worth of neurotransmitter. What will determine the overall amplitude of the EPSP reaching the site is the number of these synaptic sites which are active during a short period of time. And that's going to be determined by whether or not we have 20, 30, or 50 individual neurons, with each of those forming 10 or so synapses, and each of those contributing a small depolarization. But many, many neurons will be involved in activating this membrane out here. Inhibitory neurons as well. If not, let's now move on to inhibition. Let's take the upper panel, and we'll simply start this by talking about inhibitory, synaptic transmission. There are two major players in inhibitory synaptic transmission in terms of the neurotransmitters. The two major inhibitory neurotransmitters are GABA. The official name for GABA is gamma, amino, butyric acid. GABA, or gamma-aminobutyric acid, is nothing but a slightly modified glutamate. You take the amino acid glutamate, you chop off the carboxylic acid on the main chain of the glutamate molecule, and you end up with GABA. So you take glutamate, which is an excitatory transmitter, chop off the carboxylic acid, and you turn it into an inhibitory neurotransmitter, GABA. But the other one that you see primarily in the spinal cord is the amino acid glycine. What these two have in common is that they bind to ligand-gated ionotropic channels. So let's imagine we have here an enlargement of an inhibitory synapse, where this is the output region of an inhibitory neuron. When we cut a section through one of these and we look at an electron microscope at one of these output regions, we can hardly tell it's different from an excitatory synapse. That is, it's chock full of synaptic vesicles. Now, these synaptic vesicles will be filled with the neurotransmitter either GABA or glycine. But just as we saw day before yesterday, some of these vesicles are clustered right up against the membrane, and they too reside in the membrane right adjacent to voltage-gated calcium channels. And the story is the same up to this point. We find that when we open the voltage-gated sodium channels, sodium comes in. That's a positive charge. That swings open the voltage-gated calcium channels. When the voltage-gated calcium channels swing open, they now allow for the influx of calcium. And then we won't go through the machinations, but remember, calcium binds to synaptotagmin. That invokes the snare complex. We then fuse the membranes together and release neurotransmitter. So fundamentally, everything we see on the presynaptic side is exactly as we saw earlier. We needed depolarization to open calcium channels. Calcium comes in. Calcium then triggers the fusion of the vesicle with the plasma membrane and release the neurotransmitter. We can then think about, over here, the postsynaptic element. And the story here will be pretty similar. Over here on this side of the membrane, we'll have these transmembrane proteins. And the transmembrane proteins we're going to talk about here are the ligand-gated ionotropic channels. Now, let's say that these are GABA operated. So these are the GABA operated channels. So the neurotransmitter, just as we saw before, is released from the output region. The synaptic vesicles, through exocytosis, release the neurotransmitter out into the extracellular space. And again, on these receptors, we have GABA binding sites. When the GABA binds to these GABA binding sites, the channel opens. So this looks identical to what we saw day before yesterday when we used glutamate to open a ligand-gated ionotropic channel. Everything is the same. But now when this channel opens, what we find is we get an increased permeability to chloride. And so now, in this case, when we open the channel, chloride comes in. We've added chloride to the inside of the membrane. Chloride is an anion, so what's that going to do to the membrane potential? It's going to hyperpolarize it, make it more negative. You got a question?
So maybe I'm taking it from my head. So for every input, there's an inhibitory and an excitatory neuron that produce different, or do both exist in the same output region?
Okay, so this is a question of mixing and matching the receptors. And as far as we can tell, when we have these blue excitatory synapses, these will be all glutamate receptors. The truth of the matter is we have a whole bunch of different glutamate receptors, and we can mix and match those. But those are all excitatory. And then now, when we put side by side here in red circles, these now are meant to be inhibitory synapses. So there'll be another cohort of neurons that are forming these output regions. And this other cohort of neurons will now have the enzymes to make gamma-aminobutyric acid. And when their vesicles fuse the plasma membrane, they release GABA that binds to receptors, GABA receptors. Now, two things are going on here. First, it probably is true that we congregate or cluster the GABA receptors at GABA synapses and the glutamate receptors at glutamate receptors. But the other part of this is it doesn't matter, because even if we had glutamate receptors here, we release GABA, and they'll only bind and operate GABA receptors. So we now use the idea of the specificity of the receptor for the neurotransmitter to determine which ions will flow. Is that?
Well, kind of. So I mean, it does answer part of it. So both exist on the input region, but on the output region of the other inhibitory neuron. So are there specific inhibitory neurons and specific excitatory neurons?
Fair enough. There are specific excitatory neurons and specific inhibitory neurons. And we have lumped together all of the excitatory neurons as being glutamate. But in reality, there will be other excitatory neurons as well that use different neurotransmitters. But about 80% or more of the neurons in the central nervous system are glutamate. And then you'll have another set of neurons that contain GABA. And those then will open the GABA receptors and produce an inhibitory response. Okay, so you have excitatory neurons and inhibitory neurons. Excitatory neurons release, excitatory neurons will release neurotransmitters that open cation channels. Inhibitory neurons, for the most part, will open channels that open anion channels or chloride channels. Anything else? Yes. So the question about the astrocyte, yes. Just as we talked about earlier, where at excitatory synapses, the astrocyte will play an important role of removing the neurotransmitter glutamate, we do the same thing with GABA. I'm not sure what the inactivation system for GABA is, but we will take GABA up into those astrocytes. Anything else? Okay. Oh, man. So now what I want to think about is what's going on at those inhibitory synapses. We've described up here the idea that we've opened these channels and we have increased membrane permeability. To chloride. Now we're back to the mantra. That is the membrane potential. The membrane potential seeks the equilibrium potential. For the ion whose permeability is dominant. So in this particular case, we're going to open chloride channels, so now we're going to increase the permeability to chloride. And so if we start here with a membrane potential that's, say, minus 70 millivolts, and at this point we open the chloride channels. If at this point we open the chloride channels, now let's say we set the equilibrium potential, the E sub Cl, at minus 75 millivolts. So we open the chloride channels. We're going to drive the membrane potential toward the equilibrium potential for chloride. So that means the membrane potential is going to hyperpolarize toward minus 75 straight away. You can see how that's going to be inhibitory if it's hyperpolarizing. Spell this out as a hyperpolarization. And if we were to imagine to perfectly superimpose on that hyperpolarization a depolarization of 5 millivolts. So if this was a depolarization intended to go to minus 65 millivolts, then the two are going to cancel out and we get no effect. That's true. And you can, in fact, think of inhibition as being a hyperpolarization offsetting a depolarization. And commonly that's the way we talk about it. But it's an incomplete description, because we could also play the same game here. And rather than setting the equilibrium potential for chloride at 75, let's say we set the equilibrium potential at minus 70 millivolts. So now we have a bunch of inhibitory neurotransmitter release. They open these GABA-operated channels. And what's going to happen to the membrane potential? It's not going anywhere. It's stuck at minus 70 because the membrane potential seeks the equilibrium potential for the ion whose permeability is dominant. The equilibrium potential is minus 70, so it goes nowhere. Now, that's inhibitory too, because if now we start to try to add some positive charge on that, we effectively use the predominant chloride permeability to hold the membrane potential at that point. We can even go to an extreme where we can set the equilibrium potential, the E sub Cl, to say, oh, minus 60 millivolts. Then when we open these GABA-operated channels, the membrane potential is going to depolarize. It's going to depolarize toward the equilibrium potential for chloride, which we've just said is minus 60. Now, we have preached over and over again that depolarizations drive the membrane potential toward threshold. But look what happens here. If threshold is set at minus 55 millivolts, as long as the equilibrium potential for chloride is more negative than the more negative than the threshold potential, we're going to hold the membrane potential at that because the membrane potential seeks the equilibrium potential for chloride. So it's inhibitory regardless. That tells us that we can have inhibitory potentials that are hyperpolarizing, unchanging, or depolarizing, and in all cases they'll be inhibitory. In the final minute, let me put one piece up here and I'll leave you with this. And we'll come back to this tomorrow. And that is, these potassium leak channels were important to us. But now, in addition, we're going to put these GABA-operated chloride channels. And these GABA-operated chloride channels now will decrease membrane resistance. So hold on to that idea, and we'll come back tomorrow by talking